Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Suzanne Harris. Thank you so much for joining me today. On our podcast, we talk to the authors about themselves, we talk about their books, and we also talk about their ideas. Each and every book has two stories, and we will talk about both stories. Joining me today is Dr. Daniel Brubaker, and he's here to talk about his book, Psychosocial Political Dysfunction of the Republican Party. Dr. Brubaker has spent half of his career in academic medicine at such institutions as the University of Pittsburgh Health Science Center, Oklahoma University Health Science Center, at both the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of California, San Francisco Departments of Pathology. He spent the past 20 years in the medicine industry, which includes both legal and clinical medicine. Dr. Brubaker, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to Books on Air. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. We'll have fun, I'm sure.
I think we will, too. This is such an interesting book, and I'm always curious. You know, it occurred to me several years ago, I guess, that books don't just tell one story. The author tells a story in their book that's meant for the reader. But there's always something behind the book. There's always a reason that the book was created. Tell me about how you chose to write this book, Psychosocial Political Dysfunction of the Republican Party. Where did it come from? How long did it take you to write?
Well, it took me about 3 years to write, and it kind of came from my observation of the Republican Party over the past 30 years, and I saw how bad it was getting over the past 7 years. So what I've done with the book is I used my background, medicine, science, and also I've had an interest in philosophy and psychology as a teenager, reading books then, and I have an interest in sociology as well as logic and history. So I used all those all those disciplines to write the book, and I wanted it to be educational, and I wanted the reader to think about what they were reading, use critical thinking, so that they would come away from this book more knowledgeable about different things that I think the Republican Party is getting into.
Well, you've got 10 chapters, and I can imagine that it took at least 3 years because each chapter is extensively researched and documented. You give people, the definitions of terms. It's just such a comprehensive book. Let's give the listener a little bit of an overview of what you cover in the book.
Well, the Republicans, I think, have a hard time distinguishing between fact and fiction. So the first chapter is about that, and I go into a lot of detail in terms of how facts are accumulated and how we use those facts in different ways. And I have some medicine in there as well as science. It may be a little bit difficult for some people to understand some of the science, but I want them to still read it and be educated with it. And then the second chapter's on child development with behavior, because it's child development from age 2 to age 5, because what I've seen with the Republicans is really childish behavior. So I included that. And then I go on to the more psychosocial or psychological aspect, including personality disorders. And then the next chapter is on the why Republicans call Democrats socialists, which they're not. And I go through all the aspects of socialism so that people understand what socialism really is. And my opinion is that the Democrats utilize social democracy and not really socialism, because socialism also involves a economic system, and we don't have that. And I don't think people realize this, but we had a socialist party in the United States from 1900 until 1972. Didn't go anywhere, but it was trying to become an economic system as well and overtake capitalism. So we've had socialism in this country, real socialism. And then I go on to crowd theory. And the reason I brought up crowd theory is because I had a political journalist from New York tell me to include that because he thought it would be a good idea to bring up the fact why Republicans follow people like Donald Trump and DeSantis and all these other Republicans. So I include that, and I go through all the different crowd theories and come up with one myself, or a couple myself. From there, I go to, fascism, because I want the reader to understand what fascism is, and I think that's something that the Republicans are sort of going in that direction, and I want them to understand all about the history of fascism and all the suffering that people go through in a fascist country. Then I do the kind of psychoanalysis historically with the Republican Party. I then do Chapter 8, which is on Donald Trump, and I have a couple pictures in there. And that's and then Chapter 9. I do kind of a synopsis of the whole book, and Chapter 10 I use my opinions now. Everything else is factual, but I use some opinions as to what I think we can do as far as improving democracy in the United States.
Now, you yourself have been a Republican all your life. Is that right?
57 years. And I guess the Republicans would call me a rhino. But at least I don't belong to the rats, which I call Republican at Trump's service. Yeah. I mean, I voted for Democrats. I voted for Republicans, and I in the book, in the last chapter, I have a job description for the President of the United States. I don't think we have a job description for the President. I don't include anything like, movie stars and football players and those types of things. I have a really good job description that I think people should follow, and whether they're Republicans or Democrats, they should fit the job description and do the best thing for the country.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, isn't that what this is all about? I mean, isn't that what government is supposed to be doing?
It is what government's supposed to be doing, and it kind of goes astray here and there. I mean, it's not just today. It's been that way off and on in the past. I mean, the 1930s and 1940s had fascism included in Congress with people that considered an approval of Nazism and that type of thing. And we're kind of going through it again. What we don't learn as human beings, I think, is that we don't go back through history and try to stop repeating the same thing over and over. And I don't know why human beings do that. I try to address some of that myself in the book a little bit, but it's something that, we do as human beings. So I wish it would change, but I don't know if the brain will change. I think it's kind of fixated.
It is interesting. If you really look back over what the country has gone through, I mean, the McCarthy trials and, those kinds of different things, the Cold War that we all went through, and the world just seems to be such a mess right now. And it just seems like everything is so uncomfortable, and it seems like the pandemic just exacerbated everything. What do you think?
Oh, it did. And it created a separation of people in our country. I mean, we've had people that approve of vaccinations, and we have people that disapprove of vaccination, thinking that they could, it's their right, their freedom not to have vaccinations, and the government shouldn't interfere. But I'm a big proponent of vaccinations, and I even describe that in the book a couple of places about vaccinations. They've been excellent in terms of eradicating disease, polio, almost measles, but not quite, smallpox, and different other infectious diseases. So I'm a big proponent. I'd rather have the vaccination than have the virus. I have not had the COVID-19 infection because I've worn masks. I got all the vaccinations, and I'm happy I haven't had the infection because I don't want it. I don't want it to get into my body. I'd rather have the vaccinations, which, medically I know what vaccinations do. So they're safe, and I'm a big proponent of them.
One of the things that I found so fascinating in the book is what you just did. You have this broad spectrum of knowledge and this broad spectrum of the way that you think. And you have taken those different professions, different points of view, and you've woven those into this book. And I think it makes it particularly interesting because you have that a perspective that I just had never thought of before. There's a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. He once said, "The human mind, once stretched to a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." And I think what you've done in this book is exactly that because of the way that you put it together. Was that your intention?
Well, I think it was. I don't think I was intentionally trying to do that originally, but like I mentioned earlier, I used all the disciplines from science, medicine, psychology, philosophy, and various disciplines to kind of prove the dysfunctionality of the Republican Party right now. And I think there's a real problem, possibly with mental health in the Republican Party. So, yeah, I've used everything I could to do that, but I don't see it as I was doing it intentionally. I didn't do it that way. It kind of all fell together, I think, at the end.
Well, I'm glad I saw the perception. I mean, to me, whenever I was reading, I thought, wow, because it just felt like I was looking across a spectrum, and that gave me a different perspective and a different point of view than I think I would have ever had, because I don't have that kind of background and I don't have that kind of vision. So I thought it was terrific, actually. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Certainly. Dr. Brubaker, how did you do the research for this? I mean, did it take you 3 years just to do the research, or did you write it as you went along? What was the process for the birth of this book?
Oh, that's an interesting question. When I was in ninth grade, and the science teacher said, you can't know everything possibly in this world, and the only way you can is go to the library and get your questions answered. And I've been doing that all my life, and I've been involved in research. I actually discovered a new disease that no other doctor discovered, which we called post-transfusion graft versus host disease. And I also came up with a diagnostic test that one other doctor in Munich came up with the same test, and he kind of beat me to it. But I think, let me go back to your question again. Could you bring that up? Right.
I was just talking about, how did you do the research? Did you do it a little at a time? How did you pull all this together, I guess is really the way to put the question.
Okay, so I started off with fact versus fiction, and then I just started outlining different things, and I did all the searching on the internet. Mm-hmm. Since we have that at our fingertips, and it takes a lot of work to go to the library and research everything. And so having the internet at our fingertips with things like PubMed and Wikipedia and other educational sites, I pull up everything I possibly can, and I just go from there. Now, one of the things that I didn't do is I didn't have a lot of references for every fact. And I did that intentionally because to do that is far more work. I would do that with my publications in medicine and medical textbooks and medical journals.
Certainly.
I would do all that, but I didn't do that for the book. I have some references at the end of where I got all the information, but and that's pretty much it. I do have a couple of references here and there that I thought were important.
Here's a question for you. Often when authors write a book that is a personal book, and this is a very personal book, as they write and as they go through that process, they learn something either about themselves or they learn something that they didn't know previously. Was there any kind of epiphany that took place as you wrote the book?
I think the history of socialism and the history of fascism, I mean, I was somewhat aware of those things, but to get more detail embedded in my brain about all those issues, and especially in the different kinds of socialism and how fascism got started, and those were really important to me. And also the crowd theory. I thought that was really fascinating, going through all that and getting everything put together. And I could now see a little bit more how the brain works in terms of bringing that all together. So I even describe that in the book. I show how the brain works for some of these different behaviors, and I think that I do that for the reader, so not to I do it so that they kind of understand how the brain works. Good. And how the behavior works with the brain.
Good. I think that's important. And we've been talking about this book, and I know that our listeners are saying to themselves, okay, where can I find this book? So I'm going to tell them, and then I'm going to ask you if there are some other places that it's available. Now, it is on Amazon, so let me give you, dear listener, the title of the book, and let me do a little spelling for you. The title of the book is Psychosocial, Psychosocial, Psychosocial Political Dysfunction of the Republican Party by Dr. Daniel, Daniel, Brubaker, Brubaker. Now, go to Amazon. You'll see a very large little sort of light gray box. Put that information in the box, and in the left-hand side there's a drop-down menu to choose from for different categories. Choose books. Click on Dr. Brubaker's book. It will take you right to it, and there is a fabulous excerpt right there on Amazon that you can read. There's also an audio book that's available. So you can order it right there on that page. Now, Dr. Brubaker, it's been my experience that sometimes our listeners don't want to buy the book from Amazon simply because they're the largest bookseller in the world. Are there some other places, if our listener doesn't choose to buy the book from Amazon, where else might they purchase it?
Okay, so they can get it at Barnes & Noble online. And also from my website called Republicans4Progress.com. And the audiobook you can get through Apple. And I did the audiobook because I knew there would be people with some disabilities that, had problems reading, and I thought it would be important to do that as well. Now, that was a little more expensive to do that, but I thought it was important. So those are the places you can get it. And I'm trying to sell as many as possible because I want to help students at my college where I graduated. I would really love to set up a scholarship program for them because I came from a very poor background as a farm boy in Pennsylvania, and we were almost in poverty, except we grew our own food and everything. And so to get through college, I worked myself completely through it. Now those were different times in the 60s or in the 70s. So, but I'd like to also do that to help young people get ahead.
So part of the proceeds from the sale of the book will go to a scholarship fund?
Yes.
What's the university that the scholarship fund will be found in?
Well, it's not there yet, but I have to accumulate enough money to set it up. But the school I went to was Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, which is a really, really good school. It's a Christian school, or it was a Christian school with the Church of the Brethren. But now the church couldn't afford to keep up with the costs and everything, so it went on its own. But it still has a lot of Anabaptist history behind it.
I think that's wonderful that you want to help young students, because in this day and time, education is extremely expensive. And thank you for doing that. I think it's wonderful.
I hope I can accomplish it.
Tell me some more about your website. If our listeners go to the website, what else will they find there?
Oh, that's another educational website. So I have a lot of things there about Republicans and things that aren't in the book, like I define what woke is, and I define critical race theory, some of those things. And, also classic liberalism, which is what the Republican Party started out with in the 1800s. And then they moved to conservatism in the 1920s and 1930s, and have remained with conservatism since. But we all started out. I think Ron DeSantis wouldn't realize this, but we all started out as Republicans to be woke, because that's what created the Civil War, actually. So
now you're also doing a lot of social media. So how can they find you on Facebook? How can our listener find you?
Okay. Again, that's Republicans for Progress. And Twitter's a different one. Let me get that for you.
Okay.
I think it's Rep, isn't it? Rep, R-E-P.
Yeah, Rep for Progress.
Rep for Progress.
Number 4.
And that's number 4 as well, not F-O-R, but number 4.
Okay, the number.
Yeah, yes.
Now, what have you got on Instagram?
I don't have a lot with Instagram. I'm doing a lot more with Twitter now, and I tweet different things. Things come to my brain here and there. Different things like definitions and what's happening today. What's recent. I haven't done anything on Tucker Carlson yet, but that may be next. I don't know.
Well, this has just been fascinating. Now, I always like for the author to have the last word about their work, especially a work as thought-provoking as yours. The listener will become a reader, and when they pick up a copy of the book, Psychosocial, Political Dysfunction, and the Republican Party, they'll sit down. This is not like a romance novel. They're not going to just read this from cover to cover in 1 or 2 sittings. This is a thought-provoking, intellectual book They're going to sit down and they're going to begin to read, and it will make them think. And so they'll put the book down and they'll come back to it. They'll put the book down and they'll come back to it. But eventually, they will come to that very last page of the book. They'll read that last page, and they'll either electronically or physically close that cover. What do you want that person who is that reader to take away from the book when they finish it?
Well, I want them to come away with it being further educated. This was my intent to begin with. I wanted to have the book completely factual, which it is. I wanted them to be analytical when they're going through the book and use critical thinking. And I wanted to create some debate as well. I know it's very controversial, and in fact, on Amazon, there's a reviewer on there that's Republican. I think he's a little more far right, but he's being critical of the book, and that's fine. You know, I don't really want everybody to think that this is the way to go with the Republican Party. I think it should create a debate, and I think we should consider the future of the Republican Party. And right now, I don't feel like it's going in the right direction for young people, and I think the young people are getting that. I mean, we're seeing protests. We saw them in Tennessee, and they're happening around the United States where young people are coming out and protesting. So I think the Republican Party needs to change their behaviors a little bit to do things a little more normal, I guess you would call it.
Well, you've certainly created something that's perspective-altering and thought-provoking. I want to thank you. I have enjoyed this so much. You and I could be talking for an hour. I mean, it would be so easy for us to do that. It's just been such an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being my guest today. It's just been interesting and, as I said, thought-provoking and perspective-altering.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time. Thank you.
Good. Now, remember, you can find Dr. Brubaker's book, Psychosocial Political Dysfunction of the Republican Party, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and on his website. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. I'm Suzanne Harris, and I do hope you'll join me for my next Books on Air podcast, because remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. So thank you so very much for listening.